So we're going to move on. So I'll be giving the talk next on narrating the what and why of our moral actions. So we talk about people and their moral actions all the time, right? For example, we might gossip about whether a friend did a good or bad thing and give judgments on what kind of person they are. And today I'm going to argue that this communication often takes the form of narratives. So to give you an intuitive example of what I mean by that, consider how the group of people who went into the US Capitol on January 6th have been described by others. This news article describes them as a violent mob who, after hearing speeches from Trump, committed an act of domestic terrorism, whereas Trump himself said simply, well, people went to Washington because they're actually smart and they're patriots. They were angry about a rigged election. And I think you'll all agree, hopefully, that these contain competing narratives about the same target. And you all probably also have a sense of what's not really a narrative. So when asked to comment on these insurrectionists, Eric Trump simply said, let's skip the 6th. And former VP Mike Pence just answered to the interviewer, I'm always hopeful about America. I always believe that America's best days are yet to come. And you're likely going to think, yeah, these two don't really have narratives in them in the same sense. Although you might also be thinking, well, I can kind of tell that there is one in there, it's just not being said. So what exactly is a moral narrative and how are they told? There are many approaches to studying narratives, but we're building particularly on the work of philosophers Greg Curry and Rachel Fraser. And I'm not going to show any modeling data or talk about models explicitly, but many of you might also recognize parallels with the rational speech act theory, particularly this paper on politeness. And so today I'm going to introduce how we're thinking about moral narratives and then show some behavior data testing a particular component of this framework. So to establish some terms, we think moral narratives are always told by a narrator to an audience about a target. This arrangement can actually take different forms, which I'll bring up later. In order for a moral narrative to be told in the first place, there needs to be some moral event that's triggered. So let's say the target of the narrative commits a moral action, like an employee embezzling money. It was because they wanted to buy a sports car. And objectively speaking, there are actually all kinds of details that can be true about this one event. Now, let's say there's a narrator then who knows all these facts that I just mentioned. The narrator doesn't know just the details, but they also have a subjective viewpoint on what kind of the person the target is, what their moral character is like. So for this narrator, maybe what's important is the fact that they committed this act for a very selfish reason, which makes the employee a bad person, and none of the other details I mentioned should matter. In other words, a narrator's subjective viewpoint brings attention to particular details the narrator deems relevant for moral evaluation. And typically in moral narratives, these end up being what the target actually did and why. So things like their particular actions and explanations for these actions. But this is still not quite a narrative. Narratives are instead about what a narrator decides to communicate to an audience. And so with an audience present, then the narrator now has some communicative and social goals to consider. For example, they have to decide whether to reveal their subjective view, whether to actually be informational. And because we are talking about people, narrators will often also have a reputational goal, how they want to appear to the audience, what kind of moral target character they want the audience to think about. So think, especially in the case of first-person narratives where you are narrating about yourself, most of us want to appear like a good person to others. And so in our informational and reputational goals can actually conflict when you want to appear better than you actually believe yourself to be. And so narrators have to decide which goal to prioritize oftentimes. It's pretty straightforward what they should do. If they're prioritizing information, they can just tell the truth. Whereas if they're prioritizing reputational goal, they can just lie and do things like describe a false action or explanation. But these options both also come with trade-offs. If you did something morally bad, telling the truth means risking a bad reputation. Lying is also potentially really costly if found out. So today I'm going to be focusing on another case where a narrator might try to balance these two goals. And the key hypothesis I'm going to make is that narrators can achieve a balance by being vague about what the target actually did or why. For example, as Pence did, they can simply not provide an evaluation of moral character at all. And the idea is that they can then both avoid revealing a bad reputation, but also not telling an outright lie. So here's the first part of experiments I'm going to show you. I'm going to start by actually validating and exploring the extent to which narrators actually tell vague narratives given a discourse context, and then use narratives where we manipulate vagueness and ask if it indeed arises from balancing of these goals. So we're going to be using a task where participants are narrators. They first make a moral decision affecting the earnings of a coworker, and then they have to communicate to a different person who we call the audience. And we're going to look at what one group of narrators actually say to the audience in this context, as well as another group who instead picked narratives that we gave them options for. And we also asked them how they valued each narrative according to such info rep goals, and looked at whether those values predict their choices. So here's the task. The narrator first solves a puzzle, earns a bonus, and finds out about a coworker who also solved a puzzle and earned a bonus. And then the narrator is given a choice to claim a raise, where doing so doubles their earnings, but poses a different risk for the coworker. So if the narrator claims, the coworker has a 50% of losing, but if the narrator doesn't claim, then the coworker only has a 10% chance of losing. And so the claiming is more selfish, and the data today, only narrators who claim became narrators, and about 60% claimed. And after the claim decision, the narrators then find out that coworkers ended up losing their $1. They then find out that there's another person, the audience, who they will show a narrative to. And upon reading that narrative, the audience will then have the power to adjust their bonus, increase it or decrease it. Narrators are told that audiences know that the coworker lost the money, but not whether that was because the narrator claimed the raise, and so they can lie. So what do people actually say? Here's some free responses of 92 people coded for whether they describe the relevant action or the truthful one, which is claiming the raise. About 10% of people lie and say I didn't take the raise at all. About 20% tell the truth and say they give an explanation. But the rest of participants actually did neither. Some statements were really ambiguous as to what they did, like I did what I needed to do. They describe an action that's not really relevant. I worked hard at the puzzle. A lot of people describe no action at all, like innocent until proven guilty, or describe something really, again, like the task. The difficult part of this task is that regardless of what I chose, the other party could lose their bonus. And so importantly, yes, narrators actually really love telling fake narratives in this context. So I'm going to test more directly how goals then affect their choice in a 2x2, where a statement can contain a clear, truthful, or vague action or explanation, where a clear action says, I decide to claim the raise. And then we have this weird vague counterpart that just says, this was a weird experiment. For a clear explanation, we said, I really didn't care about what happened to the coworker. We chose this selfish one so that there's some reputational motivation not to say it. And the vague equivalent was, I would be interested to see the final results of the study. So we end up with narratives that vary in how much info they're providing for a moral evaluation to be made, with clear action and explanation on one end and the really vague one on the other, and the other two in between. And so for each narrative, we asked, how likely are you to actually show this? For informational value, we asked, do you agree with it? For reputation, we said, guess how you think the audience will adjust your bonus upon hearing it, whether they're going to give you more or take away. So people answered on a slider, and so I'm going to show the data like this on the x-axis with the 4 narratives, where these two contain the action in blue and the other two the vague statement, and these two on the left contain the selfish explanation, the other two the vague. So first, remember I said we designed them to vary in how clearly they provide a moral evaluation. And so where we assume that the action of taking the claim and the explanation that they didn't care are both selfish. And so that should be reflected in narrators' guesses about what the audience will think of them. And that's indeed what we find. So admitting the action is bad, and then the admitting the explanation is also really bad. And the narrators think that on the far right, the vague narrative won't make them look as bad as any of the other 3. For informational, we of course expect them to say they agree with the statement that they claim, because that's what they did. And then it turns out they don't really agree with the selfish explanation we gave them, although they don't disagree strongly either. So they end up in the middle. Importantly, narrators say they agree with the vague narrative. That's important because we think that's part of their values, that they're strictly speaking not false. Finally, this is narrators' likelihood of choosing these narratives, where we see a preference for the vaguest and the one without an explanation. And with model comparison, we find that including both informational and reputational goals predict these choices much better than just one goal alone. And so our main predictions were confirmed in this pretty broad way. But coming back to this vague statement from Pence, one thing you might wonder is, well, is being vague really not without a cost? Doesn't this seem really weird and suspicious? So based on this intuition, we've been thinking about adding this additional second order goal of presentation where the narrator thinks about how the audience will perceive their goals, whether they're going to believe that they're trying to be informative, where the idea is that if you're suspected of being deceptive, then that might actually backfire on a narrator. So next, we additionally asked, do narrators actually consider and value presenting an image of informativity? So coming back to these results, we then we asked, will the audience be satisfied that you gave them all the information they wanted? And this is the result where narrators say audiences are probably expecting to hear about the action. They predict that they don't need to hear about the explanation. But then narrators don't end up actually really caring that much about this. And so presentational value doesn't factor into their choices. So the best model is still the one with just informational and reputational goals only. So we were kind of puzzled, why don't narrators actually value presentation? And one thought we had was, well, should they care about presentation in this context? Are there any consequences of being perceived as not informative? So we additionally asked in a separate group of audiences whether they actually perceive these vague narratives as uninformative, as well as whether they end up disliking or mistrusting the uninformative ones. So first we asked, is this all you wanted to know? And yes, audiences actually reply that they want both clear actions and explanations from the narrators so that the vague narrative is seen as really, really not providing the expected information. But importantly, when we ask, so how would you adjust their bonus? Audiences actually don't really punish narrators for not giving them the information they want. So yes, they are more likely to take away money from narrators who gave the selfish explanations, but there's no extra cost of being vague. So to explore why the last piece, we asked audiences to explain why they think narrators are communicating in this way for each of the narratives and looked at 3 responses again. And so I'm going to show the 4 again. And I just want to direct your attention to the vague narrative at the end, especially. And audiences say, yeah, sometimes they say low information implies deception. So they think the narrator is trying to mislead them or hide something bad. But audiences also very often think, well, the narrator is just confused. They're bad at communicating or they're not really trying hard. In other words, they're inferring that narrators might not even have a communicative goal at all, or they're just failing to achieve them. And so what we think this means is that there's actually kind of an additional benefit to vagueness in addition to the ones I mentioned, which is that from the audience perspective, a vague narrative could be because a narrator is either being intentionally deceptive or unintentionally being uninformative. And the narrator can then exploit that kind of uncertainty. And so zooming back out, I hope I've given you some sense of what narratives are, that they're an interesting kind of communication that we potentially can carefully study, and happy to talk to you about some future directions that we're thinking about if you're interested. I think for time, I'm just going to end there and thank Molly and the rest of my lab.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I may have missed it at the very beginning, but when you sort of had the first group of participants who got to choose, whether they were going to lie or be vague or provide a truthful answer, I'm curious if you think that whether they were considering, because the audience didn't know if they were lying, right? They didn't know who to, but the experimenters do. So I'm wondering if you thought about, are they balancing informational, reputational goals, or are they balancing 2 sets of reputational goals?
Yeah.
Right. Where there's an audience that's ignorant that you can just lie to and get away with it, but there's another audience that knows if you make that choice.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know the answer to it, but I think that kind of question comes up a lot. Like, how many reputations are you considering? So I actually hadn't thought deeply about that, where the reputation of the experimenter is also coming online. But there's also the question of whether, like, when you're talking about yourself, um, your the two reputations are actually blurring because you're caring about your reputation as a narrator, but also as a target. But then when you're talking about someone else's reputation, you might be caring about your reputation as a narrator and a reputation of the target. And so we don't know exactly how to, like, we're starting with like the simplest kind of model, but potentially it can explode and have like all kinds of reputations that you're considering. One of the things we're most interested in is actually self-narratives, where you're both the narrator, audience, and your target and the audience. And there's a lot of evidence that people actually do talk to themselves a lot in that way. And it can potentially say something about how we end up with self-deception. Sorry, that answered your question. I don't know if it answered your question, but it was a long one.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think the self-deception idea is really interesting. I think from the experimenter case, I'd be interested if if you set up a case where you convinced them or told them that the experimenter also doesn't actually know what they did, and see if that really shifted people's performance or not. And then I think self-reputation could potentially still come into that, but you'd at least remove the sort of the second audience that knows when you're lying.
Yeah, I think we would have to put in the IRB that we aren't going to look at the narratives, like tell the people that the experimenters aren't going to peek, but then actually look at them anyway. But we have actually tried not having an audience and seeing what people say. And the results actually look pretty similar. So I think a lot of times people assume, like, even if there isn't an audience, they kind of act like there is. And it's really hard to turn off that kind of sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
We actually have 1 minute left, so. I lost my paper. Ida, you want to come up? Are you going to connect? Okay. Oh, it's.